Today we're going to review marine chordate diversity. And first we need to define what a chordate and what we largely think of as vertebrates are in terms of their characteristics. So first, the word chordate is largely referring to vertebrates. We also have a term called craniates, which is going to refer to all those chordates that have a head, and that's going to be all modern chordates. Most vertebrates have the development of a head within a brain case. They have a vertebral column, which is a series of bones and cartilage. They also have, at some point in their life, a notochord, which is a flexible rod made out of material similar to cartilage formed by mesoderm cells. They also will have an endoskeleton, which is essentially a series of bones or cartilage that's going to create a framework internally. There's a few other special characters that chordates tend to have. One is the fact that we see the arrival of jawed organisms, so organisms with a jaw. As we increase in the complexity of chordates, we find lungs or a lung derivative. There is also lobed fins that develop in somewhere in the mix there, which we'll kind of review, which provided skeletal support for chordates. And then we see the arrival of tetrapods, which are going to be organisms that have two pairs of limbs. Finally, we have this term amniotes, which is going to refer to the terrestrial adapted egg. And lastly, in mammals, we find milk production. So if we take a look at the phylogenetic tree for these organisms, we can see how those characteristics correspond to the different groups. First, in chordates, we have that occurring here with the lancelet and whatnot. We have craniates happening at the level of the hagfish, and then vertebrates, organisms with a vertebral column, are part of the group of chordates, but only kind of start to arrive over at the hagfish and lamprey kind of branch of things. Also, those characters we mentioned, the jaws, lung derivatives, so on and so forth, you can see where those characters arise in the phylogenetic tree as well. So let's go ahead and walk through those organisms, starting with the lancelet. And these organisms are small, elongated marine chordates. They have a notochord, which is that characteristic of chordates that's important. And that they are going to resemble fish, but they lack a jaw and sense organs. So they're not going to be quite the same. These organisms tend to live within the sediment, bottom sediment, and the tentacles that you can see in the top portion here are used to capture small bits of plankton and algae and whatnot as it floats past, or any kind of they largely can feed on any kind of material that falls to the bottom there. Just another important thing to note is that with these chordates, as we ended the invertebrate section, or the invertebrate kind of lineage of organisms, all of those characteristics that were present in the most advanced of the invertebrates, which would be those echinoderms, are going to be present within this organism as well in terms of the structure, the tissues that make up the organism, and things like this complete digestive system. So you won't see an incomplete digestive system anymore in these chordates. The other thing to note regarding this is that while we tend to think of chordates as being largely vertebrates, and those words are used interchangeably, as you can see, this vertebrate kind of element and the presence of vertebrae in these organisms does not occur for all of them. It only occurs up at this, chordates can and are differentiated in some of these groups. So the lancelet does not have a vertebral column. Next, we have tunicates, which are marine filter feeders. They have a water-filled sac-like body structure. In this picture here, these images here, you see a version of the adult version. There are two tubular openings to these organisms that are called siphons that draw in and expel water. As you can imagine, this helps them in order to be able to not have to allows them to not have to deal with having to kind of manage their internal environment if they can be similar to the external environment in terms of ions and salt concentration and whatnot. The adult, as I mentioned, looks like this with the two siphons present. There's a complete digestive system there, and advanced tissue, despite the fact that it looks quite simple there. So the other element that's interesting about this is the larva of this organism looks quite different. We also don't see the notochord in the adult at all. We only see it in the larval form. And that notochord, again, is going to be associated with the nerve cord. In vertebrates, that will kind of be the primary structure that turns into the vertebral column, but in these organisms, it stays as this flexible, cartilaginous-based kind of rod. So the larvae are the ones that are going to have that notochord. And it's only present in this stage. It does kind of dissipate in the adult stage. Next, we have hagfish and lampreys, which are part of class Agnatha. These organisms are jawless fish. There is a notochord in the adult for these organisms, and the lampreys are going to have rudimentary vertebrae, but not the hagfish. Additionally, they have a head, so this is the first arrival of our craniates. And this is an example of the hagfish. The cool thing about this is it has these little slime glands that are located along the exterior of the fish that allows it to expel slime. And here we have an example of the lamprey. Now, the interesting thing about these organisms really relates to their feeding. So the hagfish is going to be a blind fish, but it does have a good sense of smell and touch, and it will enter an animal through a hole or a tear in the flesh, and then slime when it feels threatened. And in this video here, in this image here, we have someone who's got their hand in a big bucket of hagfish here, and as you can see, there's a giant amount of slime that's associated with these. When they feel threatened, they're going to expel all that slime, which makes them slippery so they can escape. And you can see in this figure below, we have a car where a truck full of hagfish is actually kind of spilled out. There's a video associated with that if you want to look on YouTube. Next, we have the lamprey. These are suspension feeders, so they are going to live in freshwater streams in the sediment. They actually migrate to the sea or a lake as an adult, and these organisms are considered parasites as they feed on victims' blood or tissue. And as you can see, they've got these little structures that enable them to attach themselves to an organism. And there's also quite a few YouTube videos regarding those if you ever want to take a look at some of those in the wild. And with jawed vertebrates, we finally get into organisms that are going to have a jaw consistently, so we won't see the jawless feature happen in any of the organisms going forward. But this consists of sharks and rays, which are part of a class called Elasmobranchi, or Elasmobranchs. These are also referred to as cartilaginous fish. They are formerly part of a class called chordates, but there's been some reorganization in the phylogenetic structure for these organisms. They've been similar for about 300 million years, so kind of amazing how these organisms have been so adept and suited for their habitat that they don't need to change. Most are predators. They have good vision and smell. They also have an interesting structure called the lateral line, which is a row of sensory organs along each side that detects vibrations. These vibrations are caused by animals that are swimming, and obviously you can imagine an animal swimming in distress is going to create more vibrations than one that's healthy. Rays are going to be dorsally flattened, which means that they are going to have a slightly different structure to them, obviously, than sharks, and they also have a venomous spine on their tail, or associated with their tail. Ray-finned fish are part of the class Actinopterygii. These organisms are going to be quite diverse in their adaptations. They do have a skeleton made of bone. Most of the fish that you know are part of this group, and they have fins that are supported by these flexible skeletal rods. They have flattened scales that cover their skin, something called an operculum, which is a covering to the gill. Most of them have a swim bladder, which is going to be a gas-filled lung derivative and helps them with their buoyancy in the water column. They can be found in any habitat, and there's a huge variety in the 27,000 species of ray-finned fish. Chimeras, or class Holocephali, consists of cartilaginous fish. This is mostly an extinct group, with the exception of chimeras, the ratfish found in the Pacific Northwest, as being the only surviving members. They live close to the seabed and they feed on benthic invertebrates. Interestingly enough, they don't have a stomach, just an intestine. That still counts as a complete digestive system, but just a little bit different in that they don't have that additional structure. In this phylogenetic tree, you can see that within the Devonian age here, around between about 350 to 420 million years ago, is where we had a huge divergence and evolutionary diversity of organisms that have led to the diverse groups that we have in cartilaginous fish today. Lobe-finned fish are part of a class called Sarcopterygii. These organisms are going to be slightly different from the ray-finned fish in that they have bone structures that are actually located within their fin. So if you look at the human here, and we look at the gray shaded area in each of these, that's kind of a similar region within each of these different appendages. And you can see that the humerus of an organism called the coelacanth and of a human are going to be attached to a series of bones that are going to form and continue the structure of that appendage. So this is going to be a little bit different because when you have these series of bones, it's basically going to result in and allow for more of the ability to support the body of that organism. So these lobe-finned fish have a series of rod-shaped bones that allow them to kind of hold themselves upright. This includes, most famously, the coelacanth, so it's a good example of a fish that you can learn about in order to learn more about this particular structure. And also there's a YouTube link here if you're interested in seeing a little bit about these coelacanths and how they are so diverse. So lobe-finned fish are largely thought of as the ancestors to land-dwelling vertebrates. And the reason for this is because they have that bony structure to their appendages, allowing them to stand upright, but also they have the presence of a lung in addition to their gills, which allows them to breathe air when they're out of water. And they do spend a significant time of their lives out of water because of the fact that water becomes scarce in their African habitats, or in their habitats, so that they basically are unable to use the water, oxygen from the water. So without that adaptation, they would not have been able to survive. So this organism is largely thought of as the ancestor of vertebrates and shows a really important link between the marine and terrestrial environments. Amphibians, or class Amphibia, are going to consist of salamanders, frogs, and caecilians. These organisms have something called the double life, which is a life in the water and on land. And there's varying degrees of time that they have to spend in an aquatic environment versus on land. There's also quite a bit in terms of their habitat that differs. For instance, the caecilians are going to burrow. They look like a snake, but they're just legless amphibians, and they're going to burrow into the sediment. They have to live in damp habitats as their skin supplements the lungs for gas exchange, and is thus important that it remain kind of damp. We don't find any marine amphibians, but they are an important vertebrate group. Reptiles are going to consist of organisms that, such as turtles, saltwater crocodiles, and sea snakes and marine iguanas in a marine environment. They are ectothermic, so they're cold-blooded, and they absorb external heat, so they're not able to regulate their internal body temperature. These organisms are incredibly robust. For example, the leatherback turtle migrates from Indonesia all the way to Oregon, which is over 12,000 miles away. Sea snakes are found in the warm coastal waters from the Indian to the Pacific Oceans, and they have no gills. So there is a differentiating factor when it comes to the reptiles in a terrestrial environment versus a marine environment there. Also, they'll typically have some way of excluding salt and dealing with salt exchange with their environment. So if we take a look at this phylogenetic tree, we can see that this group of vertebrates, turtles, iguanas, snakes, lizards, and crocodiles, are actually going to be most closely related to birds. So in this particular rendition of a phylogenetic tree, we can see that some of their characteristics basically are all the characteristics that they have here are also found in these birdic organisms, with the exception of birds are going to be endothermic, so they can produce their own body heat. So birds, which are related to these reptiles, but have their own class called aves, are going to have a modified body for flight. Their feathers act as airfoils for lift. They have light flight muscles along the breastbone, a reduced weight by having these hollow bones to them. And as I mentioned, they're going to be endothermic, so they can generate heat through their metabolism. These organisms are going to have efficient circulatory system and insulating feathers that allow them to habitate in a marine environment or close to or adjacent to a marine environment. And in the cases of organisms such as penguins, that insulation is so well done that it allows them to survive in quite cold climates. Finally, we have mammals and the class Mammalia. It's the one we're most familiar with in a terrestrial environment, but which is not as abundant in terms of diversity in the marine environment. So there's two distinguishing traits to the mammals. They have hair and mammary glands that produce milk. They are endothermic, similar to birds, and their hair does provide a little bit of insulation for things like seals and walruses. However, in some marine mammals, that hair is lost. They have an efficient respiratory and circulatory system for metabolism, and there are three main lineages of mammals. These lineages are largely differentiated by their teeth. So as you can see in these organisms here, fish and reptiles have kind of similar looking teeth. Mammals have this interesting structure to them that are going to be quite diverse. So just to give you an overview of the three different kind of differentiating groups of mammals, we have monotremes, which are egg-laying mammals. They are the only ones that exist are the spiny anteater and the duck-billed platypus. These organisms are not marine, but it's good to know that they are one of the groups of mammals. We have marsupials, which are going to be animals that are born instead of hatched. These organisms are going to have a placenta, so membranes from the embryo attached to the lining of the uterus to supply nutrients and blood. The development is completed while they are attached to the mother. So example would be a kangaroo and a possum. Again, not organisms we find in a marine environment. And finally, the ones we do find in the marine environment are going to be the eutherians. These mammals are going to bear their young fully developed. They have a placenta, which is more complex than the marsupials and allows for the development internally. They have an amniotic sac, which is a membrane that covers the eutherians to, again, allow for protection in the internal environment. And all marine mammals, cetaceans, sirenians, pinnipeds, and polar bears are going to be part of this eutherians group. If we take a look at the phylogenetic relationship between terrestrial organisms and marine organism, it turns out that the closest terrestrial relative to the whale is actually a hippo. So hippos are going to be the closest terrestrial relative, so probably somewhere along the line a terrestrial mammal went back to the sea, and that primitive cetacean spent a majority of its time in or near or in the marine environment, and eventually that gave rise about 33 million years ago or so to ultimately the toothed whales and the baleen whales. And that's just a little bit about marine chordates.